There are so many emotions associated with caregiving. You can feel just utter despair and frustration, sadness. You can feel joy in the little moments when the person you're caregiving for still, smiles.
Money and caregiving are deeply linked. What financial truths should millennial caregivers face early, even before a crisis hits? Welcome to Everyone's Talking Money, where we get brutally honest about money, mindset, and making life richer. Rachel, your book challenges the idea that caregiving is something that only happens later in life. Why do you think so many millennials are caught off guard when they find themselves in a caregiving role?
Such a great question. I think one of the interesting things that happens is millennials are in this interesting in between space where you're still attempting to hit life milestones, however you define that, whether that's having children or partnering, owning a home, determining what your career is. And when in many ways, millennials are more reliant or connected to their parents, at least in terms of what the data says, than a lot of prior generations, where millennials are moving back home at higher rates and moving back in with their parents, kind of than prior generations, versus kind of flying the nest. And I think those two distinct domains, which are interconnected, means millennials really are surprised when something happens to those parents that they move back to, who they're looking to for support, whether it's emotional or in their financial decision making, or in kind of figuring out what the next step is. They're connected. They're together. They're trying to figure this out and relying on parents in many different ways. And so when caregiving comes up, especially when it's for a parent, it really takes one by surprise, because it's not part of this paradigm of parents continuing to be that support system for this millennial generation. And so I think that it really challenges our expectations, and appends that sense of comfort and normalcy that millennials have come to rely on from their parents. And I say that with, of course, the caveat that not everybody is lucky enough or connected to their parents to maybe have that relationship. And I think for those who don't, perhaps that explanation doesn't resonate, but for those who do, I think it's really challenging to watch those who have cared for you suddenly become the ones who need some care for.
I had never heard that statistic or that fact that millennials are one of the most closest generations to their parents compared to previous. And it's interesting that you mentioned like going back home, maybe after college. And I don't know this, so I'm asking you. If you don't know, that's okay too. Do millennials, I'm assuming, probably got married older on average? So is that kind of part of it? Because when obviously you get married, you start your family, you start to live your own life. So of course there's a natural disconnection from everyone that's not in your immediate household. So is that part of it? Is that millennials kind of are doing things just a little bit later? The average first time home buyer age, I think, is 38 now, when it was younger than that. So do all of those factors lend to what you had mentioned previously?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think that what we're observing is that millennials are given, millennials were coming of age, and we had the financial crisis. We've had the COVID-19 pandemic. And millennials, obviously incorporate a broad age range. So this may apply less to older millennials who were kind of on a little bit more established when some of these events were happening. But we have seen that more recently, especially, folks are returning home because it's harder to engage in home ownership because of the financial environment. It's the age of marriage and of first child is increasing, and so I think that there is this. And the job market has been kind of evolving, especially as we face kind of competition from technology, and from a changing just labor force in general. And so I think, this constellation of different factors is pushing millennials and potentially, Gen Z afterwards, to shift and to come back home to the the place that they potentially left if they went out to school, at higher rates than prior generations. And so it's a constellation, I think, of financial and contextual factors that are contributing to that. And so you see, folks have lived in multi-generational families and home settings for forever. But there was, as you mentioned, kind of an earlier age of home ownership, of marriage, of having your first child in prior generations than we're seeing now. And we're seeing that also reflected in more folks living with their parents and then starting to realize, their parents are aging and something's coming and changing.
You became a new mom the same year your dad was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. So, what did that collision of life events teach you about caregiving at the age you were?
Yeah, so I was 29 when my father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's and my first son was born, which is younger than many people in my generation, but not necessarily, kind of consistent with the age we're seeing many people who are having their first kid. I was lucky. I had met my husband in college. We'd been together for a long time, kind of following many of the traditional milestones that were out there. And yet I was vastly unprepared, it felt like, for the experience of watching my dad get this diagnosis and decline. And even when I had been kind of able to achieve some of those traditional milestones, there was a sort of a shock in the disruption to what felt like my comfort and my safety net, in being able to turn to my parents to ask them questions and rely on their advice, their input. There's that sense of security they had given me just through my upbringing. And I think that as young adults, kind of become parents, or at least as I became a parent, I sort of expected I would turn to my own parents for advice. I was lucky; I have a great relationship with them. They were, both so engaged in my childhood. And my dad especially loved kids. He was a baby person, and he was really comfortable and content around children. Later in life, in his 40s, decided he wanted to go back to school and be a middle school math teacher. Like, he really signed up to be around kids. Like, maybe, some, in a way, many of us, I think, are like, whoa, that sounds crazy. Um, and so when my first son was born, I imagined he would be a huge part of his life. And I think that at the same time, we were noticing a lot of changes in my dad. He wasn't able to do geometry anymore. He was at a red light and he forgot to go when it changed to green. Very common, some would say minor or small changes, but when you looked at a constellation of factors, pointed to something that was going on. We thought, maybe, did he have a stroke? Is he not sleeping enough? But lo and behold, he officially was diagnosed with Alzheimer's just 6 months after my son was born, and kind of the history unfolded from there. So it was a devastating kind of contrast of expecting that sense of comfort and safety that comes from having your parents behind you as you navigate this, like, crazy life change of having your own children, and then watching the person who cared for you really no longer be able to do that, and no longer be able to be the same person at all.
When you said your father chose to go teach middle school, my daughter's now just finishing middle school and I have one entering middle school. Yeah. And I'm like, oh my, that is a special person
Yeah,
to choose
was
that
like
life.
Totally.
I was in the school once. I'm on the PTO board, and the principal was like, "Here, meet our new teacher," and she's bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and she's like, "I love middle schoolers," and I'm like, "Says no one." Like,
Totally.
what?
Totally. I think we were all, like, astonished. We had all grown up and he was like, "That's what I'm gonna go do." We're like, "What?" So, yes, very special person.
That's yes, that is so tough watching your parents not be the person that you grew up with and
Yeah.
who you kind of envisioned going forward, what they would be like. And whether it's Alzheimer's or cancer or it's just that journey of that, watching this person just change right in front of your
Yeah.
eyes is just so hard. How long did your father have like those little signs for before you started realizing something was off? And then also I think which is the hardest part is having that conversation with him of,
Yeah.
hey, what's going on? Something's going on.
Yeah. Um, and I totally appreciate what you just said because I think the caregiving journey, just to kind of pick up on that, of being in this like new sandwich generation where you're trying to figure out your life and you're trying to also, wa- have this experience, or you're having this experience with your parents, whether you're trying to or not. Um, that resonates regardless of the disease. The point is, like, both things are evolving and changing and they're not on the same plane, and navigating that is just really challenging. And I think sometimes it's easy to ignore these little signs because maybe we don't, and to write it off either as a sign of just, oh, our parents are becoming more set in their ways, they're aging, it is what it is, versus, oh, is this something that we need to pursue some outside health advice about? And I think for my dad, things were going on for nearly a year before he really was officially diagnosed with Alzheimer's. He, saw a general practitioner. He was having trouble with sleep and some cognitive kind of decline. Like I was mentioning more about kind of some skills. He was having trouble kind of remembering certain names or certain um, daily tasks. But it really took a prolonged period of time before the official diagnosis came. And some of that was delayed, unfortunately, because of the pandemic. The official diagnosis of Alzheimer's often comes after you've done a spinal tap where they're looking for a particular protein that has built up in the brain. And that's what distinguishes Alzheimer's disease versus dementia or another form of cognitive decline. Um, and so he was originally supposed to get a spinal tap, say, in March, and it didn't end up happening until August because of the pandemic. So that prolonged the timeline of the official diagnosis. But from, I think, time of first symptoms to the official diagnosis was over a year. And then time of diagnosis to when he ultimately passed was just about 3 years. So things in his case progressed relatively quickly. But as we were just mentioning, I think each case and each experience of the actual disease, whether it's Alzheimer's or something else, can be deeply personal and specific. But this constellation of factors that I think comes up as a millennial and experiencing caregiving, there were so many parallels. And that's one thing I discovered when I was kind of researching this book and talking to other people who had been in this position, was just how similar some of the challenges were that people were facing, even though people, of course, had their own extenuating or deterministic circumstances.
So, from a practical standpoint, what are the first conversations someone should have with an aging parent or loved one after a diagnosis? And how can you approach these talks without feeling like you're now becoming the parent?
I think, unfortunately, that reversal happens relatively quickly. You suddenly discover that you're going to be in a position where those difficult conversations are going to become kind of part and parcel of your evolving relationship with your parent, or the person that has received a diagnosis, because of course it's not always a parent. um, and I think in the context of Alzheimer's or something that's affecting someone's brain, is that you very quickly have to have conversations that address the fact that they are likely not going to be able to make decisions for themselves in the future. And those conversations were extremely emotional. And I think we were lucky that we had a healthcare provider and a social worker who encouraged us to have those conversations. But I think that what comes to mind first and foremost is to have the hard conversations as early as possible, because they don't get easier as the diagnosis progresses. And somebody's wishes, of course, may change, but there are certain things that are unlikely to change. For example, it's critical within the US context to, designate who your healthcare proxy is going to be. Who can make decisions for you when you are no longer able to make decisions about your own health? Is it your kids? Is it your spouse? Is it a lawyer? Designate who that person is going to be. And similarly, around kind of legal decision making or financial decision making, make a plan for some of those harder processes that are going to come up inevitably, because you are going to be navigating the healthcare system, and your estate planning, and all these kind of constructs that all of a sudden come into play. um, and force you to think about, an end of life. And so it's easy, I think, easier to talk about in the abstract early on. What do you think you would want? Who do you feel comfortable making those choices? And to make time and space for the conversation when there's not an immediate urgency to doing it. I recall, talking to somebody whose parent became ill and didn't have a healthcare proxy, and the children and the spouse of the person were available to make decisions, but somebody from the hospital had to get involved, and it had to go to court. There had to be a whole process because there wasn't a designated healthcare proxy. And typically it would be the spouse, but say in this case, the spouses were on the outs, etc. So very quickly you see how any family complication and family dynamic can come into play. And so I think the key takeaways are to address the elephant in the room, to do it to make time for it, right? So it's not going to be a one-off conversation. These conversations may take time, but the earlier you start, the more likely you are to have that opportunity to kind of, discuss with the players, with your family members, with the person in a meaningful way, and not rush that decision-making process, but start, and be thoughtful about it. Give them time, take time for yourself, and then document it, right? Have it written down, make it official, because these things are unfortunately going to come up. I think in our personal case, our family's case, my dad was really explicit about his end of life wishes, about how he wanted his care to proceed, about the types of things he did and didn't want, in terms of where he wanted to decline, in terms of his priorities around safety and whatnot. And that those conversations were critical. We held on to them when he could no longer kind of articulate them later on. And so I say we were lucky because the person we were caring for really did have a vision of what was important to them. Not everybody will. And navigating, what you think you would want with what that person would want, that's really challenging. So I think that as much as possible, trying to engage in those thoughtful conversations before things feel dire can be really helpful.
And also, you talked about the dynamics, and if how for people that are like, I know I need to choose these things, I just don't even know where to start. Is it always best to default to the spouse to make decisions, or is it better to go to the children? But then have you seen through your research and interviews that if one child over another is being chosen, what qualities should someone possess if they're chosen as the person that helps make the decision and advocate on behalf of the parent, and just using that word, the parent, and how did you get tapped to be the caregiver for your
Yeah.
father?
No, it's a great question, and I think each family dynamic, of course, can vary. I think that there's a few things to consider as you're trying to figure out who makes sense as a default health proxy. Like oftentimes it does default to the spouse. And but typically you also need not one person but multiple people named, because the spouse or whomever is, the top person may be unavailable. They may themselves become incapacitated. And again, I think just this whole construct, like, it forces us to think about things that we don't want to think about. But the worst that happens is that it comes up at a time when you're forced to deal with it, and then it feels even worse, right? So, I think typically, and my mom wasn't, on the scene. She was absolutely named as a healthcare proxy, but then I became her healthcare proxy, and the backup for both. And I think that it comes down to a few different factors. One is often it helps to have somebody who is geographically proximal to whomever the person is that is ailing, because sometimes these decisions need to be made relatively quickly, and it can be hard to account for somebody who, say, needs to fly cross country to be there. Two, I think it comes down to a little bit of knowing your kids and the people in the picture. People have different decision-making styles. They have different ways in which they kind of cope and process. Some people are more emotional. Some people are more give me the data and I'll make a decision. And I think and some folks can balance both. I think, for example, like my sister was much more there on the day to day helping with our dad, but she didn't feel comfortable being a decision maker should something need to come up. And we had those conversations with each other. I was probably one step removed from doing as much on the day to day. I had my young children, but was very involved in kind of the research and process and practical steps of what was an appropriate place for him to go and where should he be. And so based on those respective roles, it fit more within my purview of what I was kind of contributing to the family caregiving team. And so I use as an example to simply say, I think it depends on a few factors. It depends a little bit on the people and the place in which they're at, and it depends on the interpersonal dynamic among a family as well.
Money and caregiving are deeply linked, yet they're rarely talked about together. So, what financial truths should millennial caregivers face early, and how can they start preparing even before a crisis hits?
The financial strain of being a caregiver, I think, cannot be emphasized enough. And I think, unfortunately, there's very little, as you just described, that's actually out there around how this can unfold. So, just to paint a little bit of a picture, there are many people who experience a long-term illness, say, have health insurance, but health insurance won't necessarily pay for certain components of long-term care. Care that's needed to sustain health and life, beyond kind of the need for a specific procedure or a visit to the doctor, right? All that stuff that goes into somebody living, not just visiting the healthcare system. And so, of course, there is long-term care insurance. Many people don't have it, and the coverage when you actually try and go for it can be pretty poor. So what that leaves is a really patchworked system of nonprofit organizations, grants, Medicaid, it depending on your age, and Medicare, to try and kind of fill in the gaps of supporting somebody who is ailing. And the other thing that means is that it often falls to the family themselves to figure out what they can contribute financially to support somebody who needs care. Families go bankrupt as a result of caregiving. I mean, and it's not for the faint of heart to kind of get into this space and think about what are you comfortable contributing, especially as a younger adult who likely is saving for some of these milestones we were mentioning before. Maybe you want to buy a house. Even if you don't want to buy a house, maybe you have rent to pay and the month-to-month expenses are really high. Maybe you're saving for something for your kids' future, and all of a sudden you have to think about, well, can I take this money I was going to contribute to their 529 plan and put it into, something that's supporting my ailing parent. And all of a sudden, it becomes incredibly challenging to think about these financial trade-offs when you're actually engaged in the process of caregiving. And I will say that when you are in the thick of it, you feel like you would do anything to improve the quality of life of the person that you are supporting, and spend anything, because it's so challenging to watch that decline. And then whatever you've just spent X amount of money on no longer works because their condition changed and you are out of pocket a lot of money, frustrated by how you spent it, and there's no way to get it back. So I think what's critical is kind of trying to set a rough budget in advance of what you are comfortable financially contributing. And not everyone is going to be able to financially contribute. Maybe it's a certain amount of money a month. Maybe it's simply being able to pay for yourself to go visit X amount of times to be there in person. Maybe it is to support a particular kind of construct, like, oh, I will pay for a therapist to do X, Y, and Z with the person. And maybe it's none of that because you're not in a position to financially contribute. And so setting those kind of rough parameters for yourself, I think, is really critical because, like I said, the costs can spiral. And it's very easy to spend on something and then for it to not materialize into actually being the therapeutic approach that you thought it would be, and then you're left kind of frustrated and out of pocket a lot of cash. And so that budgeting for what you can contribute to the caregiving process is critical to think about as much as you can.
And we talked about some of the first conversations someone should have with an aging parent or loved one a- after a diagnosis, but like there should also be a financial talk as well, right? Like what kind of, not what are we working with, but what is this looking at? And you can probably look up the average cost of
Yeah,
someone in care, and this is what we're
absolutely.
in for. And having that discussion as a unit, I think, is also really important. So then you're still going to have all those emotions. It's still a horrible experience going through it, but at least if you're aware financially what is going to happen, it's still double whammies, but at least you know what you're in for, I guess.
Absolutely. And I think the biggest thing that when I talk to people about this now is so much of kind of getting into this caregiving space is expectation management. So there's going to be a lot of costs, there's going to be a lot of emotions, and there's going to be a lot that you have to do, and it's going to pivot really fast. And so trying to have some of these challenging conversations and plan for what you can, as you just mentioned, what are we working with, right? People have different financial resources. Sometimes they have assets, they have a house. How important is staying in that house to them? Because, getting rid of that house can mean that you can move somewhere else that's more supportive of whatever your care needs are. You're changing physical abilities, or you're eligible for certain programs because you no longer have an asset that you're hanging on to. And so, trying to just have that conversation. And there are financial planners who are specialized in this if you are so inclined and to use one, or have access to that, and tools online too to help you think about this kind of budgeting exercise. But have the conversation with the person who's ill while they can still kind of make sense of their finances, and have the conversation with people who are showing up to be part of the caregiving team, whether that's other adult children, whether that's an extended family. But bring people to the table early.
And there's a whole nother element to millennials being caregivers in that they likely are working. You know, generations prior, most households just had one person working. But now, when everyone's working, that's also another element to this. So you talk about work life integration instead of balance. So, what does that look like in reality for caregivers who are juggling demanding jobs and caring for their elders?
Yeah. I always find the word balance funny because it makes it seem like one thing is completing the seesaw for another thing. And I think the reality of caregiving is there isn't balance because it's all just kind of piling on and when we or happening at the same time. And I think that's true of caregiving for your kids and working. I think that's true of caregiving for somebody who's ailing and working. And in this case, it could be all of that together. And so I think that time management becomes of the essence, um, where it's in the same way we're talking about kind of your financial budgeting. You have to think about your time budgeting. There's only a certain number of hours in the day, and just because you've added caregiving for somebody who's ailing to your kind of list of to-dos, even if it's the highest priority, the other things have to exist. We just talked about how expensive caregiving is. It doesn't, for many people, it's not possible to quit their job and become a full-time caregiver. And it's also thankless and then really challenging to re-enter the workforce as you've kind of navigated that. Or to It's not an option to not do stuff with your children. They still need to get to eat and get to soccer practice and do the whole thing. So figuring out what your time allows for is critical. And maybe there are certain windows of the day that work for you. Maybe there are certain days of the week. Maybe it means every X amount of weeks I'm going to go visit my parents and just show up and be present and do that then. And maybe it means none of that works for you, but you do have more financial resources and you're going to contribute something something else because you don't have the time to do it otherwise because of your kind of competing life priorities. And I think that it's important that in some ways we're transparent with ourselves and with each other about what is possible. For I would take my son to visit my parents every kind of so often. We had a schedule. And as much as I wanted to be there all the time, every week, it was impossible. He had to get into a routine. He had to kind of complete certain milestones as a young child, and it wasn't fair to his development, right? And so this balance of what does my family need, what do I need? I was also a public health professor. I was also working, so though I had flexibility, and also wanting to be part of my parents' life, and so and support them. So yeah, integrating things time wise, and then trying to integrate things functionally as much as you can. And what I mean by that is, okay, you're working on a schedule for your child. Are you able to kind of take that base and work on a schedule for the person who needs care? Who's going to support them at what hours of the day, and in what ways? And so I talk a little bit about the idea that actually some of the skills are so parallel between caregiving for a parent, between what we need to do in our professional life, and also how we are supporting our children. And though there's some humor in that, there's also just some reality to that too.
Yeah. So, what are some of those skills that people develop through caregiving that can actually help them when it comes to a job search or a promotion conversation?
Yeah. And so, I had this, at first, when I was kind of thinking about this concept, I talked to a few people about it, and they said, I haven't necessarily thought about it that way. But the way I would describe it is when you become a caregiver, um, you realize how much first you have to work on time management, and you have to be willing to compartmentalize, to plan, and to advance kind of a particular project or set of person, um, to support their needs across a relatively unknown horizon, right? You plan in short bursts, you plan in longer term, so you're working on time management, you're working on kind of short term and long term planning efforts to support this kind of endeavor that you're working on. You also are working on navigating, and you have to navigate an extremely complex healthcare system that we have. That relates to our insurance system. It relates to a litany of different providers that come into play when you have a condition that you're navigating. If it's heart disease, you have a cardiologist, you have a primary care professional, you have different kind of therapists who are going to support different symptomatology that somebody's experiencing. You likely then are getting a neurologist involved because the heart and the brain are potentially connected, or a pulmonologist, right? So there's so many people at play who you have to go see and learn how to talk to. And then there's also the back end of it, the financial navigation of what you're going to be experiencing. How do you get reimbursed for these visits? How do you fight with an insurance company? What's an ICD code, and how do like when someone has a diagnosis, to make sure you get reimbursed for that visit, or that condition? Um, so right now we've mentioned kind of the time management or project management. We've mentioned kind of the healthcare navigation component. That also applies to thinking about how do you navigate and figure out the safe spaces or places that your loved one can go if they're no longer safe at home, and the long term care kind of nursing home, hospice sector is a whole entity unto itself that so many people don't understand. And finally, you learn to be a little bit of a social worker. You understand a lot about mental health and support. And these are not just abstract skills; they are a critical kind of um, set of sectors in the world right now that a lot of people are going to have to navigate. So I know a significant number of caregivers who have actually become health navigators or patient navigators as they have moved on from individual caregiving to try and support other people who are kind of going through this experience, who pursued social work, or kind of being hospital persons, or who pivoted careers entirely. But if none of that appeals to somebody, I think just leading with this notion of time management skills is critical.
We can't have a conversation about anything without bringing up social media and its influence. It can be a blessing or a curse in this space. What are your do's and don'ts for sharing about your caregiving journey online, especially when it involves vulnerable family moments?
Social media is such a dual-edged sword in so many different, I think, components of life. And I think that each family has their own norm around what's comfortable to share. I was always like, "Mom, don't put my son on your Facebook page, whatever it is." But I think that each generation also has their own sense of what media channels they like, and each family, millennials tend to be more active on Instagram, Gen Z's on TikTok, and now I think it's boomers that are on Facebook. That's not exactly right. It's not only one for each generation, but that tends to be, I think, the most used platform for each generation. And so I think that in some ways, how you share your caregiving experience depends on what your baseline comfort was with social media in general. I know for me personally, I found it really challenging in general to share the experience I was having with my dad with anybody until almost it was towards the end of that journey. And in some ways, that was because I felt like I was violating his autonomy or his ability to kind of tell his own story. And in some ways, it was because it was so hard to articulate how crappy it was. Because it's not cool and sexy to talk about, oh, there was a minor flood because the sink was left on, and then we had to deal with that, and then he got really upset because he was still hungry, and yet we're dealing with a flood, right? So, it's not a glamorous experience in many, many ways. And at the same time, by not talking about kind of the depths of the challenge, we are not, I think, prepared to have that experience ourselves because our peers are not talking about that. My friends were all, sharing their weddings or engagements or an amazing trip they were on or what food they were eating, maybe their kids. And yet I was kind of looking at that and doom scrolling and when I was having this caregiving experience. And so I think that social media can be an important way to actually communicate what a caregiving experience looks like. And I know that there are a fair number of folks who are out there who are kind of sharing and posting on a more regular basis their day to day as an active caregiver. And I think that that can be uncomfortable to look at. But I think for others who are having that experience, it's incredibly valuable to see that and have, your own day to day represented by somebody else as well. And I've seen the caregiving community really grow on social media. So I think it depends on your comfort level with social media to begin with in sort of sharing yourself and your family. But I think it also provides an opportunity to see the realities of caregiving, either to get a sense of community or to recognize that it's out there and it may be coming for more people.
And for someone that is in a caregiving experience or was a caregiver, there's so many emotions that you face. How do you navigate those, especially like maybe some resentment, um, or anger? What advice do you give to those that are feeling those emotions and, how to walk through them?
I think you hit the nail on the head when you said there are so many emotions associated with caregiving. And I think what's critical is that they can exist at the same time. You can feel just utter despair and frustration, sadness with the caregiving experience, and you can feel joy in the little moments when the person you're caregiving for still smiles when they see you and your kid, and you share kind of like an unexplained but really special moment, or when you have a really wonderful day at work, you get a promotion, something great happened. It's cool to celebrate that, and you need to, because we can't just be in the depths of despair all the time. So what I try and talk to people about, one is to kind of accept it all, because it has to coexist, and to make space, however you make space for your emotions, when you can. So whether that's going for a walk or talking to a therapist or having dinner with friends, talking to your partner, listening to music, but find that mechanism to decompress because there's so much going on that it can be really overwhelming. I think there were moments where I would find myself just overcome with emotion and I couldn't even necessarily tell you which emotion it was, but it's just this constellation of a lot happening and not not having the words sometimes to articulate what it was. Um, so I think each individual perhaps has their own coping strategies when we are overwhelmed, but I think it's critical to recognize that there's going to be so much happening together. And one of the challenges, I think, of being a younger adult and being a caregiver is that caregiving does coexist with so much good happening in life too, or so much that you want to be good and you want to still achieve. And I think that there was at times guilt associated with continuing to pursue those things, to go on the vacation or to take my kid to do something novel or I don't know, attend a happy event. And at the same time, like joy exists at the same time sadness does, and we have to kind of make space for that. So I think it's critical for anybody who's having that experience to just allow themselves to experience both and to identify the coping strategies that seem to work most effectively for them.